Hello, and welcome to another edition of Brussels Sprouts. I'm Andrea Kendall-Taylor.
And I'm Kate Johnston, standing in for Jim Townsend.
This past Tuesday, Russia hosted a high-profile summit of the BRICS Plus group in Kazan, Russia, a major PR win for Putin, who is using the summit to demonstrate that Russia is not isolated on the global stage. In fact, the group has expanded its membership during the past year, underscoring the frustration with, and therefore the demand for, an alternative to the current US-led system. This year, the BRICS welcome new additions, including Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, which participates in the group's activities. The group now includes 45% of the world's population and 35% of global GDP in purchasing power parity. Indeed, Iran's addition is among the more interesting, underscoring its increasing coordination with China and Russia and their ability to give political top cover to their partner and normalize Tehran's relations with the rest of the world. Yet, despite this expansion, the BRICS group continues to face internal divisions, as certain members, such as Brazil and India, do not want to sign on to the decidedly anti-Western agenda embraced by Moscow and Beijing. Looking ahead, how should we interpret the evolving role of the BRICS, and what does this evolution mean for policymakers in the West? To unpack all of this and more, we're very happy to have Alexander Gabuev with us on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be back.
Very quick bio. Sasha is the director of the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center. His research is focused on Russian foreign policy with a particular focus on the impact of the war in Ukraine and the Sino-Russia partnership. And I should note he had an excellent piece recently in Foreign Affairs called "The Battle for the BRICS: Why the Future of the Bloc Will Shape Global Order." So maybe we can start with what your understanding of the picture is from Putin's perspective, from Russia's perspective. How has Putin framed this summit in Kazan? How has it been talked about and covered in the media inside Russia? Is it the PR win that he was hoping for?
I think it is a PR win, and there are three layers in my view. One is the optics, and the optics couldn't be better. Just look at the number of pictures with Putin surrounded by the leaders of India, China, many other countries around the world, just beyond the extended BRICS. And the narrative that Putin is the global pariah. He is reduced to begging Kim Jong-un for artillery shells and is so lonely sitting there in the Kremlin and crying, just doesn't have legs. And I think that beyond that surface and the symbolic message, which is unfortunately coinciding with the negative dynamics on the battlefield in Ukraine, with cancellation of Rammstein grouping before that in mid-October, and increasing difficulties that Ukraine is facing, and the sense that there is Ukraine fatigue kicking in many of the Western capitals, and problems that arise because we don't know what's going to happen in the US after the presidential election. I think that the timing is just really ideal for Putin. The message is, I'm not alone. I have this very big group of countries that don't feel embarrassed to come to Kazan, shake hands with me. Look, I have the UN Secretary General.
And even hug. There's hugs.
And hugs with the leader of the largest democracy in the world, India. I have a member of NATO, Turkey's President Erdogan, who finds it possible to come to me, have bilateral talks, and be part of BRICS Plus, like the expanded outreach format. I'm a wanted criminal by the definition of the International Criminal Court that sits under the jurisdiction and auspices of the United Nations. But guess what? The UN Secretary General, Guterres, is not embarrassed to come to Kazan to have discussions with me and be around, because BRICS is a group so big that it's impossible to ignore. And as the leader of the most representative global organization, he has to be there. So things could be better. There are couple of wrinkles in that picture, but we can discuss about that a little bit later. I think that the second layer, which is also very important, is really the emergence of BRICS as a club that represents the growing multipolarity in the system. The unipolar moment is gone, and it's not only the US and group of America's friends. Various formats, and like these formats are also expanding. You have Quad, you have expansion of NATO, but nevertheless, there is a group of countries that regularly are coming together. And yes, it was born out idea of Goldman Sachs economist Jim O'Neill, to market portfolio of paper from the emerging markets to Goldman's clients. And yet it was Russia that was pumping a lot of political life into this alphabet soup. And after 15 years of deliberate effort of creating that, you have a political grouping. Yes, it's not a bloc. It's remotely as efficient and as impactful as G7 yet, but it's there, it's growing, and countries around the world are interested to join it. And I think that that's a very powerful message here. And then Putin also wants to put more practice into that and create more pragmatic frameworks for cooperation that would help his major goal, which is to win the war against Ukraine and by extension, the war against the West, because he frames it and sees it as a more existential conflict between his country and the global majority that he leads, in his view, against the global minority led by the US. And I think that here the success is really mixed, because a lot of things that Russia really wanted to bring over the finish line, the creation of the payment system inside BRICS that would be alternative to SWIFT, BRICS bridge, has never materialized for very obvious practical reasons, and we can talk about that. But the emergence of the group is there, but like what's there beyond symbolism is more questionable. And then final point, I think that BRICS, as many of the multilateral platforms, be it UNGA, be it G20, provide a lot of room for bilateral discussions. And in the current circumstances that Russia is facing, a lot of these discussions have the public phase where very little is announced. And then there is a large part of content that's part that is under the water and is invisible to us. I will give you one example. China. Russia has pinned a lot of hopes on the high-level meeting between ministries of finance and the governors of the central bank that was hosted about 2 weeks ago in Moscow. And many of the principals didn't show up because it's too toxic to talk about de-dollarization effort in Moscow with senior Russian officials. But the principals, the head of the People's Bank of China, the Minister of Finance, and a couple of other senior members of Xi Jinping's economic team came to Kazan for the summit, where there's no agenda for them. There is no format that envisages their active participation, but their Russian partners are there. So most likely these are bilateral talks, and they're talking about, how to make sure that the payments between the two countries run in national currencies and all of that without a lot of public scrutiny. And I think that this set of arrangements to meet a lot of leaders, President of Turkey, leader of Iran, Xi Jinping, Modi, is something that is of tremendous value for Putin. And again, since that's the underwater part of the iceberg, the practical value is hard to assess, but I think it's there. So all in all, a pretty good 3 days for Vladimir Putin.
You've set the table wonderfully, and I know Kate and I are going to pull on different threads, but I think I want to start with the Russia-China thread first. And you mentioned how, Russia has in large part pumped a lot of life into BRICS and tried to give it some momentum. But as you point out in your piece too, China's the political weight behind the grouping. Can you talk about kind of China's views of and vision for the BRICS? And one thing that I'm particularly interested in is when you're talking about Russia, China, or the axis of upheaval, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, people will say, well, they don't share a common vision of the future. Would you say that for the BRICS, that Russia and China are aligned? Do you think that they share a common positive vision for what at least this grouping should be?
I think that in our piece in Foreign Affairs that I have co-written with my brilliant colleague Oliver Stunkel, who is also at the Carnegie Endowment working on democracy, and he's also a professor in Brazil, we see these two clubs emerging inside a bigger BRICS family. And one is the club led by China and Moscow by extension, where the goals are aligned and they want to turn BRICS into this big force to transform the international order and make it non-American. So BRICS is the anti-American force in their framing to dethrone the United States and create alternatives so that the US and Western power by extension vanishes and is reduced to just be a regional player. Where the other parts of BRICS, particularly India and Brazil, but some other countries too, are more interested in amending the order, making it more just, more inclusive, creating more room for maneuvering and more power for them, but are not necessarily interested in turning the order upside down, replacing the US with China or with any other set of powers. So they are more interested in reform rather than revolution, where Russia and increasingly China are more revolutionary forces to an extent. I think that it's interesting to take a step back and think on how BRICS emerged, like outside of the marketing idea in kind of alphabet soup cooked in Goldman Sachs' kitchen. I think that what really gave it impetus to exist as a club was the Great Recession, the global credit crunch of 2007, 2009. And back then, at their first summit in Yekaterinburg, also in Russia in 2009, the idea that brought leaders of then Russia, China, Brazil, India together was reform and adjustment to Bretton Woods institution, redistribution of quotas based on the relative weight of various economies by PPP, not by nominal GDP. So it was really reform and editorial comments, not the change of the system overall. And I think that for a very long time, BRICS maintained this stream as, hey, we don't want to change the system. We want to update it in a non-fundamental way that will make it more just and more functional and more inclusive. And there was a tilt around Russian thinking and Chinese thinking that coincided with more adversarial relationships between Russia and the West and China and the West. And I think that roughly it's around after Crimea annexation, when Russia embarked on challenging the established European security order to defend what Putin defines Russia's national interests with much more muscle and military might. And the tendencies that existed during Hu Jintao's reign in China were much accelerated and turned into a much more forceful, muscular, even aggressive breed of the Chinese foreign policy under Hu Jintao. And I think that increasingly you hear when when Xi Jinping and Putin speak about the West or what BRICS should stand for, it's increasingly defined in this anti-Western tone. Well, Putin is very vocal about that, but I think that Xi Jinping also criticizes the West for the neo-colonial practices and wants to pitch BRICS with China at the helm as an alternative. I think that there is some difference between the visions. It's very difficult to hear what kind of positive vision Mr. Putin has. Because he has, we're going to have a democratic, inclusive, rules-based order that is based on respect for international law and fundamental principles enshrined in UN Charter. And that's where I think it's hard not to laugh or cry or both, because Russia stands as one of the largest overt violator of this. It's just enough to look at the daily stream of horrible news from Ukraine to see that his comments are hypercritical, to say the least. But in case of China, I think that China put forward some of its ideas as very loosely defined frameworks, like Chinese ideas for the common global security and prosperity and development goals. And I think that this vision is so far fluffy, like it's not very concrete, but probably China also wants to elaborate that over time as China's relative power in the system grows, and it will cross the river by touching the stones, to use the old Deng Xiaoping's quote. So maybe the end goal is not necessarily the same, but the intermediate goal to dethrone the US is very much shared between Russia and China, and by extension, the new member of BRICS, Iran. And that's the glue that keeps the countries strongly together.
Can I just pick up on that question around Iran? Because, you've talked about there being almost two blocks within BRICS, China and Russia having this very clear anti-Western rhetoric. Now we have Iran in there too. There's 3 of the 4 members of the Axis of Upheaval now in BRICS. But there is this other grouping with Brazil and India who do more want to see it as a way of moving to a more genuine multipolar polar world. As there are more members who join BRICS, some of whom who are maybe joining because they're hedging their bets, some of whom share that anti-Western rhetoric. Is there a risk that the group becomes kind of more diverse? It's harder to hold together. Like, how much of that anti-Western rhetoric is holding the whole group together? Or are we starting to see it kind of splinter into different groupings?
I think that the risk is very real, and it's already materializing, because once you bring so many countries with not only different visions about how the international order should function and how BRICS should function within this international order, like what's the common agenda, but also bringing their own little rivalries and animosities, like Saudi Arabia and Iran being part of the same organization, hardly makes it more functional. So I think that we've seen that already. If you take the look at the Kazan Declaration, it's 43 pages long, but G7 also sometimes produces very lengthy declarations that if you have sleep problems, you read them before you go to bed, and then you fall asleep in the middle, and that's the perfect remedy. But all of the G7 declarations are frequently dotted with, like, and we're going to establish the fund and a pocket of money where all of the G7 countries will contribute something and do something together. So there is a lot of common actions and pledges to pool resources of these 7 large industrial democracies together that share values, that share a lot of economic standards, and that share the way they operate, so they can pool resources together and do something practical. Kazan declaration doesn't have that. Like, it's a very long a la carte menu for various ideas that various members could pick up, but then it doesn't really create a list of deliverables where that will be co-funded. And I can give you one example. Because of the actions of some members, like Russia blatantly violated international law by invading Ukraine, annexing part of its territory, uh, and has been massively sanctioned by the US and its partners since February 22, which meant that the new development bank that BRICS has created as like first as a supplement, but increasingly also as an alternative to the World Bank and like all of the institutions inside the Bretton Woods family, cannot do projects in Russia. Why? Because NDB, as a global financial institution, needs to issue bonds on global markets in US dollars, right? So if it does projects in Russia, it immediately undermines its own financial sources. And that's why, despite all of the Russian courtings and Putin having meetings with Dilma Rousseff, the president of NDP, nothing materializes, right? So bringing all of these countries together, which have various status in terms of being sanctioned, like Iran and Russia are in one category, everybody else is in a somewhat different category. It's just very hard ideologically to find common agenda other than things that they don't like about the international system. And sometimes these are different things. And more importantly, to act together. So I think that here the utility of BRICS so far remains to be seen. However, I would caution everybody from just dismissing BRICS and saying like, oh, it's just a club, they meet all together, but like nothing practical is happening beyond the bilaterals.
Yeah, this is what I wanted to ask about, Sasha, because I mean, I'm all of the nuance and details and, yes, different divisions, bringing different tensions into the organization, different visions about how they want to organize themselves in the international system. I mean, it would be easy, and I think many have for a very long time, dismissed BRICS as a nothing burger. So I know I'm just moving you, getting you to your next point that you already wanted to make, but I really want to underscore it. Is it a nothing burger? Is it, it's just a shop window and it's all there for show? Or are there things that you think Western policymakers need to take seriously?
I think that first of all, show in itself is important. Like the symbolism of that. You remember how U.S. policymakers were happy about the UN General Assembly votes on support for Ukraine, right? And you just mark the group of friends of Russia, Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, and you say, ha ha ha, Russia is so lonely. I think that this pictures and the meetings and so on is a counter narrative that's pretty powerful. Xi Jinping is a busy man, so is Narendra Modi, and so are many other leaders. The fact that they find this 2 or 3 days in their busy schedules and they're not embarrassed to come to Russia means something. And like BRICS is a good conduit for that. What's also more important is that Russia has weathered a tsunami of sanctions that was unleashed in the shortest possible period of time. Like, sanctions have been slapped on global powers like Iran or DPRK over lengthy period of time, and that gave them ability to adapt. With Russia, like the most potent sanctions have been unleashed in a matter of 18 months. And yet, Russia is standing, its economy, it's growing, well, thanks to like large injection of money into military sector, and it's able to prosecute a very costly war. Why? It's because the share of the non-Western world has increased in the global economy. Not everybody sees eye to eye with the United States. And there are a lot of disagreements, and countries don't necessarily oppose the United States or will be vocally critical, but they find it possible to work with countries like Russia to their own benefit. And I think that here, BRICS, not as a club, but as a trend line of what's happening in the global system, is very important. And finally, and that's more about BRICS practically, I think that it's hard for me to envision that they will come up with a solution to the payment system, like alternative to SWIFT or something like that, that will be shared by platform, or at least it will be as functional for everybody on the platform as the new development bank. So it will be a common platform that doesn't work with some of the countries inside BRICS because of the sanctions regime. But I think that a lot of countries are looking at the US and US dollar focus, like global international financial system. And first are increasingly concerned about the sanctions overdrive, right? Like sanctions are US weapon of choice increasingly. So you cannot really believe that, oh, you invade your neighbor and that's the only reason why you can be sanctioned. You can be sanctioned for multiple reasons. And I think that increasing number of people see that as very unpredictable, untransparent, and at the discretion of US president. Well, Donald Trump might be president of the United States very soon. How much trust you will have in like procedures or logic that you won't be sanctioned. So if that's the case, you want to hedge. Second part is people are looking at the fiscal position of the US, mounting public debt, mounting budget deficit. And fiscal conservatism, bringing spending under control, is not on the platform on both sides of the US vote. So, can that continue indefinitely just by the fact that the US dollar is the global reserve currency and the US can inflate its debt and inflate its budget deficit indefinitely? I think that a lot of countries doubt that. So, they think that, okay, 10, 20 years, if things continue like that, might be a huge problem for everybody. It's unsustainable. And for now, I'm so dependent on US dollar that I don't have any alternatives. But I look at Russia. The way they weathered the sanctions tsunami is because they started to de-dollarize in 2014. Took them 8 years and it was still painful, but they had these hedges. I don't, so I want to experiment. What's there that doesn't make me 100% dependent on US dollar, but makes me maybe 95%, and then 90, and then 80, and then trade in bilateral currencies, all of the alternative payment systems, all of the ideas that you can trade oil not only in US dollars, but maybe in RMB, all of the cryptocurrencies, like all of these ideas are on the table inside BRICS. And that's the best kind of basket case and sandbox for creative experimentation and thinking. And I think that as a more loose club, people will come up with a lot of ideas and bilateral mechanisms, not necessarily BRICS mechanism, but just a bowl of bilateral mechanisms that will increasingly provide this hedge inside their financial system. So over time, 15 years down the road, if Saudi Arabia trades 70% in US dollar, but 30% is all of these other instruments. And if something happens in the US market, it knows that it can expand this 30% to cover its trade needs. And it's very diversified. And yes, it's costly. It's not so convenient as the US dollar for sure, but it's a hedge in in a world that's increasingly driven by geopolitics rather by market logic and efficiency. And I think that's the challenge for the US policymakers, because if you just dismiss that and say, like, oh, it's a problem of 20 years down the road, maybe, and you do nothing about it, then the problem exacerbates and becomes increasingly real. And then the change might happen much more rapidly than we anticipate from now.
Yeah, I think there's a healthy recognition in the United States about how, like, the demand for the BRICS. And obviously, Putin has highlighted that something like 20 countries want to join the grouping. Although we should note that there's a handful of countries that have said no. Interesting to see Kazakhstan said no, Argentina, Indonesia, Algeria. So some countries are still opting out. But I do think there's a recognition that there's genuine demand born out of discontent and concern about the current system. But the one other question, it's a little bit tangential, but I also wonder if it contributes in any way to concern or reticence to join the grouping. So all of these world leaders are descending upon Kazan, and then you have this news that North Korea now is sending troops into Russia and potentially on into Ukraine. I don't know, how has that picture been managed inside Russia? Is it something that is giving leaders concern? Again, it's like this idea, the broader idea is, Putin obviously wants to demonstrate that he's not isolated, and yet he is doubling down on relations with other rogue states. So I wonder, like, how is Putin thinking about balancing that? Maybe it's not an issue for him, but do you think in any way these announcements about North Korean fighters coming into Russia and in Ukraine entering the war on Russia's side will give countries additional heartburn about joining a grouping like this?
I don't think so. And I think that the fundamental here is that the notion of what it takes to be a reputable state is increasingly different between the West and the non West. And I think that for Western countries, like, oh, you have to go to North Korea, like, unless you are Donald Trump, and like shake hands with that guy and need something from him. Like, you not come from position of strength as powerful Russia and dictate him what to do or whatever, but you actually are asking him for something, and there's a transactional relationship with this horrible, brutal regime. Oh, that makes you less reputable. But I think that in a lot of countries around the world, the sensitivity to that is just absolutely not the same. Like, countries are like, they don't have sympathy to the North Korean regime, but I don't think that they have the same level of disgust and embarrassment, even engaging with them in any form. So what prevents them is that North Korea has very few things to offer to many countries around the world, like they could be interested in, and the sanctions regimes that just make it toxic. But a lot of countries deal with Iran and buy Iranian oil. A lot of countries deal with Venezuela. So I think that outside the Western family, this level of kind of embarrassment and toxicity that people ascribe to dealings with countries like North Korea is just not at the same level. So with that, the first in Russia, like, that's not really very much talked about, and that's something that's a little bit swiped under the carpet with a grin. Like, if you like, I know that you, Andrea, follow the kind of ecosystem of the Russian military bloggers, all of these Telegram channels and so on. Like, people don't comment on that, but they're like, oh, we have no comment, and there is this just big smile, because it says that in Ukraine, the West is saying that this fight is existential and we are ready to stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. Like, people provide a lot of support to Ukrainians, but nobody officially, except for some volunteers, some observers, maybe trainers, but like people whose presence the West really doesn't want to parade and be very talkative about that. So nobody is dying for Ukrainian cause officially. Whereas in Russia, you can bring 12,000 North Korean troops, well, most likely on the proper Russian territory in Kursk, but like, Russia has some allies that are ready to die for it. And yes, like, of course, the motivation is that people are not dying for the Russian cause, but they're dying for money. And that's just a very pragmatic, cynical bargain between authoritarian Moscow and authoritarian Pyongyang. But the message it sends that Russia can also muster support from some other countries. It can be ruthless, cynical, and very pragmatic. And I think that that's something that's also in many quarters of the world is actually appreciated. It doesn't tell you that Russia is reduced to this kind of very rogue, powerless player that has to beg Kim Jong Un for something. It shows that Russia is pragmatic and skillful to get stuff that it wants and paying back something that Kim Jong Un wants.
I mean, just to pick up on that point, you're kind of talking about how some of the actions that Russia is taking is appealing to many countries in the global south. And I think in your article in Foreign Affairs, you talked about how the West could respond to some of the expansion of the BRICS, working towards a more equitable order. And some of that involves applying sort of so-called international rules and sanctions, which we've talked a lot about, more equally. And that there is a lot of frustration in lots of the global south or the global majority about that unequal application of the rules-based international order. But I mean, is that a realistic prospect? We've seen some things come out of the UN around the Pact for the Future, Summit of the Future. I don't know whether the gathering of the BRICS leaders this week will be a catalyst for more thinking about that. Or is that just kind of what we would like to see, but it feels very difficult in this current circumstance to actually see that happen?
I don't think that it's aspirational, frankly, by me and Oliver. We don't think that's happening because there is pragmatic need to undercut resources of your adversaries and inflict pain on them and attach costs to something that the US describes as bad behavior. And like in some cases, that's really blatant violation of international law that should be punished. And since there is no way to punish that through accepted mechanisms inside the UN, where there would be UN applied sanctions, then you do that unilaterally. But the original thing, frankly, is also that the US is also guilty of massively violating international law. And I think that when people throw a what about Iraq, a lot of people in the West say, oh, that's like stop throwing RT talking points at me. But I think that there is a deep misunderstanding that like the grievances are very, very real. And the narrative, which I think that many of the people from the so-called global South I talk to genuinely believe, is that, well, the US had this unipolar moment where it was the bearer of the standard, and it used its tremendous power to abuse the rules, went circumventing the UN, and then it also provided aspiring powers around the world a template how a really powerful country behaves. If the rules don't work to you, you just work around the rules. And that emboldened Putin and Xi Jinping and others to do that. And it's a criticism that's very hard to refute, because it's very hard for me to imagine a reconning, like a public apology or whatever, and what will be the moment of closure where we could really turn the page and start anew and build a system that's really, really invested into the international law. That system probably never existed in humanity because we are all humans and unfortunately imperfect. But I think that this level of discrepancy is very much there. So I think this recommendation is more aspirational than it is realistic. I think that realistically, you can fine tune some of the sanctions and the application of secondary sanctions and threat of secondary sanctions to some of these countries. And it's just a very complex picture because, well, the global trade system is increasingly anti-trade and increasingly more about closed blocks rather than revival of WTO after the ordeal with the Doha round. But I think that just creative positive stimulus for countries to, adhere to some of the norms and rules versus just carrying a big stick from which people will try to find antidote. That's an interesting intellectual exercise. I don't claim to have any answers. One very simple measure that we offer is symbolic. It's purely symbolic in nature. The fact that leadership of IMF and the World Bank is reserved to Americans and Europeans is just so insulting to countries in the rest of the world, because there are multiple very capable, trained economists and finance professionals in Nigeria, in Indonesia, in India, and China, and so on. So making that more inclusive will create an impression that the system is really more just and more open, and it doesn't only work for the West. So even the symbolism can matter, because it can create openings for these countries to be more invested in the system. And that's where we say that inside BRICS, working more with India and Brazil and other countries absolutely makes sense for the United States and the West.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely like a much bigger conversation in terms of, hold on, there's a bunny outside. Hold on 1 second and I'll do one last question. 1 second.
Don't worry, we'll edit this bit, Sasha.
No, I'm a cat person, but I love dogs. So.
I'm also a cat person, but no cat to deal with here, thank goodness.
Yeah, we were having dinner yesterday with the friends from Brookings, and like she's having a very, very cute dog, and she's very disciplined. She was sitting under the table, and we were blessed to have kind of dog persons at both sides of our table. So they said, like, "Oh, you had this cutie dog. Like, how were you hiding it?" And it's just like, yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, I was gonna say, okay, I think this could be like a whole, I mean, it can be and probably should be a whole nother discussion on Brussels sprouts, this kind of issue in figuring out how best to address the rising frustration in much of the world? And are there pieces of the order we must keep? And are there things that we're willing to tweak? Like you said, Sasha, leadership of IMF and the World Bank. But maybe we can end on one question, just kind of to broaden the lens a little bit on the Russia side of things. I mean, I think where we started the conversation was, the picture from Moscow hosting this big summit, the world leaders gathering in Kazan. The war in Ukraine has been on a relatively negative trajectory. Putin has really increased the volume, the scope, the brazenness of many of these sabotage campaigns across Europe. What do you think the picture looks like from Moscow at the moment? Do you think that the Kremlin calculates that it has some momentum going into 2025? Certainly the outcome of the US election will be important from Russia's perspective, but just talk to us a little bit, and again, in a very broad sense. Do you have the sense that the Kremlin feels like things are going in its direction, that it has some of this geopolitical momentum? Partners are willing, as you said, to fight and die for Russia in this war. Or are there concerns about Russia's ability to sustain things? Is the introduction of North Korean fighters a sign of Russia's actual problems in mobilizing forces? I don't know, and I know you can't know for certain, but what's your best sense of the picture from Moscow at this moment in time?
I think that for now, people in the Kremlin, and again, I agree with you, it's a black box. I don't claim to have lunches with President Putin and know what he really thinks. But trying to zoom out and look at the complex picture, the Russian side of the equation, the Ukrainian side of the equation, the Western side of the equation, and the rest side of the equation, that look gives Mr. Putin a lot of confidence that he has the time, and he is pretty sure that he might not achieve the maximalist outcome, Western acceptance of Ukrainian defeat, Ukrainian acceptance of its own defeat on Putin's term, recognition of Russia's sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, and reestablishing the European security architecture according to Russia's preferences. That's unachievable for now. And I think that people in the Kremlin understand that clearly. However, if you reach a conclusion to the hostilities in Ukraine sometimes next year or around 2026, that will be clearly seen as Ukrainian defeat. That will be not total defeat, but just the fact that Russia will most likely keep some of the territories that it currently occupies under its control without legal recognition, but it will be controlled by Russia for quite some time. The fact that the balance of destruction and death between Ukraine and Russia is asymmetrical. Like, war has been conducted mostly on Ukrainian territory, and that the very aspirational definition of victory by President Zelensky, his peace formula of 10 points, will not be achieved. I think that will be not only pitched inside Russia as victory, but also perceived by Putin as victory. And unlike Western political leaders, unlike President Zelensky, who has to worry about the attitude of the population, the political calendar, for now, Mr. Putin doesn't have to worry about that. His next re-election is 2030. He then has another constitutional term till 2036. He is still relatively young. He is in his very early 70s. He's fit. He looks healthy. Whatever the diseases are most likely in steady remission and under medical control. And I think that various fundamentals inside the Russian system give him confidence that he can kick the can down the road for quite some time and introduce necessary adjustments to allocate more resources to the war that will be sufficient enough to inflict pain to Ukraine that Ukraine will not be able to sustain. Because the Ukrainian side of the equation is similarly impossible. Russia is not 10 feet tall. It doesn't have manpower to go after lofty goals like capturing Kharkiv or going to the Ukrainian south and reoccupying Kherson, for example, crossing Dnipro River. Like, Russia doesn't have manpower and material to do that. But it's sufficient enough to deliver Ukraine very powerful blows in Donbass that will really press Ukraine into the corner. And Putin also is aware that Western stockpiles, like of material that the West is ready to give to Ukraine without decreasing its own preparedness for a possible military contingency, is just nearly exhausted. And rebuilding this military-industrial base, it will take time. So, looking at these fundamentals, he is confident that he can walk into 2025 no matter who is US president. Well, Trump is much better than Harris for him. But if that leads to some form of ceasefire, he knows that it might be temporary. He can go back and reconstitute his military and maybe come back in a couple of years at an opportune moment. And the hope will be that Ukraine will not do its homework once there is cessation of hostility. This is a broken, depopulated country with no NATO membership, no meaningful security guarantees that would make sure that this horrible aggression will not be repeated. And with that, the West will also go back to sleep. That's his plan. I think that what people will need to recognize that there is a lot of agency in the West and in Ukraine to prove him wrong, to show that, yes, like there will be no maximalist aspirational defeat of Russia and like a reemergence of a different Russia. That is kind of very desirable, maybe, but it's very unlikely to happen. But his maximalist goals, even in incremental pace, will not be achieved. And he needs to clamp down and come to negotiated solutions that will secure Ukrainian freedom, sovereignty, and ultimately prosperity. But that's a very, very tall order. And no matter who is in the White House, people will need to roll up the sleeves and do a lot, including with European partners and obviously Ukrainians themselves.
Yeah, I think it's such an important point. It's something that I've been talking about, thinking about. I love the point about agency that the West has. And I guess the way I frame it is like the cost of resisting Russia will only rise. And if we're thinking about the nature of the future threat from Russia, obviously, it'll be contingent on stability in Moscow, its partnerships with its like-minded partners in China and North Korea and Iran, and how durable and lasting those are, and how the military is able to reconstitute. But I think really one of the most important factors will be the investments and the actions that the West takes today. Like that will be the thing that really influences and shapes the nature of the threat we face tomorrow. So I think your agency point is so important. So I don't know, I try to end it on a little bit more of an optimistic note. It's always hard on Brussels sprouts. But Sasha, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a great conversation. The BRICS piece of this I have found really fascinating, and you've given us such excellent analysis to help us understand how to interpret it and understand what's going on. So thank you so much. And we look forward to our next discussion.
Thank you so much, Andrea and Kate. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Brussels Sprouts, brought to you by the Transatlantic Security Team at the Center for a New American Security. You can find all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And please remember to rate and review Brussels Sprouts so that new listeners are able to find the show.